Ludovico di Varthema's Itinerary of Yemen in the 1515 Woodcuts of Jörg Breu. While a handful of medieval travelers claim successful visits to Mecca, some more credibly than others, Ludovico di Varthema's 1510 itinerary is hailed as the earliest reliable European eyewitness description of the Hajj. However, a truly unique achievement which has not received adequate scholarly attention is his lengthy sojourn shortly afterwards in the isolated interior of Yemen. His narrative also has the dubious distinction of an identifiable starting point for a Western legacy of othering Yemen with lasting repercussions. Woodcut illustrations by Jörg Breu in German editions sensationalize accounts of monstrous characters Varthema sketches in his narrative. In these respects, the itinerary conforms to medieval literary conventions. However, ultimately, the legacy of this Renaissance work must be examined against the context of the present moment. As the people of Yemen suffer now in the 6th year of bombardment, blockade, and a man-made famine imposed by outside aggressors armed with Western-manufactured weapons and consent. In such circumstances, the first early modern European description of Yemen assumes a new dimension of significance, and this study will examine how Breu's woodcuts constitute the problematic birth of Yemen in the early modern European imagination. Varthema left Bologna as a young soldier of fortune for Venice, where he boarded a ship to Alexandria, assumed the name Yunus as a Muslim convert, and enlisted in a Mamluk regiment. From his subsequent base in Damascus, he accompanied pilgrimage caravans on the Mecca road between 1502 and 1504. His abandonment of this post launched the far-flung itinerary. Its second book relays his adventures in Arabia Felix, or Happy Arabia, a distinction from the wastes of its northern neighbors, Arabia Deserta. After a Red Sea voyage to the islands and coast, and through the narrow strait to the port of Aden, his subsequent land-bound journey brought him north to Lahej, to Tahirid strongholds Radat, Al-Mikrana, Zabid, and as far north as Sana'a, ruled by the Imam, before descending again through Taiz to Aden's port, where Varthema sailed on to India. For considerations of length, however, this paper will focus solely on the 4 episodes illustrated by Breu, which take place in Aden, Radat, the prison and the palace are 2 different scenes, and Sana'a. The Itinerary of Ludovico di Varthema was a Renaissance bestseller translated into every major European language by the close of the 16th century. The first edition was printed in Rome in 1510 in Italian. The choice of vernacular is notable for its sensibility to a wide appeal. The next edition was in German, translated by Michael Herr, printed at Augsburg in 1515, and featuring 46 woodcut illustrations by Jörg Breu, which would accompany later German reprints of 1534 and 1556. Over the course of the 16th century, further Latin, Spanish, French, Flemish, Dutch, and English editions appeared as well. Modern analyses of Varthema's text align with its Renaissance printings. Italian studies multiply over the course of the 20th century, while significant French studies appear later and in fewer numbers. The French and Italian monographs, however, find no counterparts thus far in English or German scholarship. The latter tend to integrate the itinerary into broad studies of the period's varied phenomena. Breu's illustrations are published in their entirety in a 1992 facsimile reproduction copy of the 1515 Die Ritterlich und Lofer die Reis, as well as in an open-access digital version realized by the Münchner Digitalisierungszentrum Digitale Bibliothek and the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek. The British Library holds several undigitized German editions, 2 1515 first printings from Augsburg, a 1516 reprint from Strasbourg, another 1518 Strasbourg print held by the Department of Prints and Drawings of the British Museum, and a 1534 Strasbourg edition. A later 1556 Frankfurt edition in the British Library, however, has been digitized and is hosted online. A side-by-side comparison of the 1515 and 1556 online editions underscore the fidelity to Breu's original cycle, in spite of a slight distortion owing to the resetting of the type and illustrations in a more narrow format over time. This faithfulness across its earliest and latest 16th century forms risks reducing further efforts to digitize imprimaturs from intermediate years to redundancy. The observable distortion in the later edition informed this study's use of images sourced from the 1515 Itinerary. Breu's Yemen cycle begins with Varthema's arrival to the port of Aden around July 16th of 1504, which would have been well timed with the August monsoon to carry ships swiftly to India if catastrophe had not struck. There, his Muslim Mamluk identity disintegrated totally. Accused of being both Christian and a spy, Varthema was clapped in irons as crowds howled for his death. The crowd's behavior must be read in context as a response to the entry of 5 Christian vessels the year prior that seized 7 trading ships via the enslavement or murder of their crews, a brutal pattern of European contact destined for repetition throughout the 16th century. Varthema's Itinerary has the ring of historic veracity in its detail that survivors who had escaped the carnage by swimming to shore called the loudest for his death. Breu's woodcut illustrates our protagonist, recognizable by his traveler's hat and slouch boots, flanked by 2 men who take him by the arms. Breu's careful attention to their wardrobe evokes European ideas about the East's wealth, reflected by sumptuous textiles. A brocade-trimmed coat and over-the-knee garters can be observed on one, a conical turban and a long dark robe delineated by short diagonal hatching define the figure facing Varthema. To the left, another well-dressed figure escorts a bare-headed man with long hair and unkempt beard. Looming directly in Varthema's path is a circular hole with what looks like a bar suspended by ropes over its opening, suggesting the possibility of torture. An abbreviated face and a small square punctuation in the wall indicates a prison cell. Breu's few but effective elements communicate Varthema's vulnerability and peril. Varthema's life was spared by grace of the absence of the Tahirid Sultan Amir II, Ibn Abd al-Wahhab al-Malik al-Zafir, who traveled to Aden only 3 times in his reign, in 1490, 1500, and 1503. Varthema arrived a year after this final departure, so he languished, by his own account, for 65 days in the Aden prison before being transferred in chains and by camel on an 8-day journey to Rada. There, his first royal audience is a turning point. Varthema transcribes a garbled but congenial Arabic conversation. Varthema denies being a spy and presents himself, quote, as the good Moor Yunus, end quote, the Sultan's slave. However, when the Sultan asks him to pronounce the Shahada, the profession of Islamic faith, Varthema chokes and is unable. Historians have interpreted a saving of face in the eyes of his European Christian readers for this refusal, which consigned him for 3 months to the prison in the Citadel, which is still standing today in spite of the recent collapse of its western section. In prison, Varthema took turns with his cellmates feigning madness. Varthema's violent inquisition of a passing fat-tailed sheep and the breaking of its legs when it didn't answer his religious questions amused the wife of the absent sultan and inspired Breu's next illustration. This woodcut is divided into 2 scenes through the use of a cutaway, separating interior from exterior space, as well as one scene in time from another. On the left, a bare-headed Varthema clubs the back legs of a longhorn sheep at his feet. On the interior scene to the right, a female figure in a long dress and a crown, Breu's clear indicators that this is the notorious Sultana, embraces Varthema, whose outstretched arms signal to his European audience his unwilling participation and blameless morality. The unnamed Sultana in Rada is reduced by Varthema and Breu to a lascivious character infatuated with the foreign prisoner and continually entreats him to come closer, to take off his shirt, to bathe in perfumes, to eat choice morsels of food, and to accept her generosity in all of its forms. An extraordinary passage touches on early modern ideas about race in the dramatic episode when the character of the Sultana laments her blackness, along with that of her husband and son, as she marvels at Varthema's whiteness. When the Sultan Amir returns, the Sultana arranges an audience for Varthema, who weeps for mercy. The Sultan grants his liberty, and Varthema falls to his knees to kiss his feet, the next subject of Breu's woodcut cycle. Parallels can be drawn between Breu's depiction of the Tahirid Sultan and other Western depictions of foreign rulers crowned in the European style, with differences in costumes assigned at the artist's aesthetic discretion. The Sultan himself appears in profile, with the Sultana behind his shoulder and his hand raised in a gesture of clemency. Varthema is prostrate in a foreshortened perspective. The artist's imagined interior of the citadel of Rada borrows coffered ceilings and ornate portals from the repertoire of classical forms percolating through Renaissance Germany. The fourth and final woodcut in the Yemen cycle does not depict an episode from Varthema's personal narrative in Rada. Rather, it journeys north to Sana'a, a leg of the journey where Varthema's claim to eyewitness insight has been doubted by some historians. Breu chooses for subject an anecdotal monstrous character, Mahomet, one of 12 sons of the, quote, Sultan in Sana'a, end quote, which Badger identified as the Zaydi Imam Ahmed ibn al-Imam al-Nasir, surnamed al-Mansur. This son, in Varthema's narrative, is a madman who bit people and killed them to feast on their flesh. Breu's chaotic composition evokes shock and horror. Two men throw up their hands at the scene of a man in the foreground who has wrestled a bearded figure to the ground. A foreshortened pair of legs is visible in the left corner, which contrasts with the dark negative space of an open doorway in the background. Varthema's reported measurements of Muhammad, quote, 4 braza high, well-proportioned, and of a dark brown color, end quote, doubtless are to reinforce his claim to eyewitness all he describes, but this detail undermines that credibility. A braza measured the distance between two outstretched arms, and with one braza roughly 5 feet, Muhammad would have surpassed Pliny the Elder's remarks in the Natural History about the, quote, well-known fact that men in India and the region of Ethiopia achieve a height of more than 5 cubits, a shorter unit of measurement calculated from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. Cannibalism in distant lands finds fantastic medieval precedent in the Anglo-Saxon Wonders of the East description of the hostess, quote, big and tall people with feet and legs 12 feet long and sides with breasts 7 feet long, end quote, who eat any person they catch, or the Donestre, inhabitants of an island in the Red Sea, who use soothsaying abilities to earn travelers' trust before eating their bodies. Later writers pushed the location of cannibals farther east to Java, and soon across the Atlantic in the early modern era's westernmost India. Cannibalism appeared as a motif in German woodcuts shortly afterwards. Sureka Davies identified examples from 1503 and 1509, which imagined in more graphic conventions the culinary practices of Amerindian cannibals. And by comparison, Breu's 1505 woodcut of a Yemeni cannibal plays to this new world zeitgeist in an Eastern setting already associated by classical and medieval texts with giant cannibals. Breu's woodcuts communicate a unique yet distorted record of Yemen's rich medieval golden age, in whose twilight Varthema stumbled on the eve of Ottoman colonization, and which is only beginning to figure within the concept of a global renaissance. It is particularly urgent for scholars to consider how early narratives like Varthema's shaped perception of Yemen through later history. Now, more than ever, the consideration of these particular German woodcut engravings transcends their style, compositions, and subjects. Early modern European descriptions and depictions of Yemen must be systematically interrogated against the realities of the present day, the full horrors of which cannot hope to be communicated here. Varthema's itinerary in this context is only the starting point for this long history, yet to be written, of the construct of Yemen in the early modern European imagination and its lingering consequences. Thank you.